Okay, well, thank you so much. Like Ben said, I work for Bumblebee Conservation Trust as their project officer for the Skills for Bee Cymru project, which started in February. I have worked for the Trust previously on various other projects in Wales, and this project I'm delighted to be partnering with the local environmental record centres because this project is all about recording. I'm sure all of you have heard in the media in the last few years that there has been quite a dramatic decline in our bee species, well, indeed in many species across our countryside, but bees have shown quite a massive decline, and I think they've captured both the public imagination and sort of the attention of governments and researchers of academia, partly because they are such important pollinators, and partly because people tend to love bees. So they have had a lot of attention, and in Wales we lack sufficient data basically to make useful conservation decisions about bumblebees. So this project received funding from a charitable foundation, and my role is to train people with an interest, not necessarily with any previous knowledge, but with an interest and enthusiasm, to improve their skills and their confidence and to start submitting records. So it is lovely to have you all here tonight. I think the course booked up very quickly. And what we're going to do this evening and next week is I'm going to introduce you to bumblebees at a real beginner's level. So please forgive me. I know there is at least one or two of you, and probably more, that have really good knowledge of bumblebees. So please bear with me. I've kind of assumed no knowledge, and that's where we'll start. And I do repeat myself a lot because in delivering training previously, we used to do it on quite sort of just an hour or two on the common 8 species, and we found that a lot of people didn't record afterwards because they just didn't have the confidence to do it. So this week and next week is going to be all about the common 8, a little bit more about recording, and then what I hope to be able to do with Ben and the other staff at this is to perhaps organise some field days. I live in Pembrokeshire, so any excuse to come over to Powys and to the 3 vice counties there, and we can have some field days and also some more advanced sessions for people who would like it. So a little bit about bumblebees and their kind of life history. So in the UK, we have around about 275 species of bee. That total does vary a little bit because, bees disappear, and quite importantly, with a growing number of bee recorders that we have in the UK at the moment, sometimes we have new species appearing. So that total goes up. We have one species of honeybee, Apis mellifera. I think the jury is still out really on whether or not this was ever native to Britain. Ecologists very much consider the honeybee as a domesticated insect. And of course we do have feral colonies, and we do have varieties within that one single species, but they don't have the diversity of the other groups of bees in the UK, and even across the world. I think there are I'm sure Claire actually might, the other Claire in the group might be able to correct me, but I think there's about 7 or 8 species of apis in the whole of the world. Okay, so they make up, in terms of species, quite a small part of our bee fauna. And then the solitary bees, which are the biggest and most diverse group. These are the ones that kind of vary year to year, and we sometimes find a new one, very much down to you know, volunteer recorders going out and finding these little creatures. So around 245 species in the UK, with a huge diversity of appearance and habit in the way that they live their lives. And what we're going to be focusing on, the bumbles. We currently have 24 species in the UK. It was almost 25 a couple of years ago, because the Bumblebee Conservation Trust has been trying to reintroduce the short-haired bumblebee down in Kent, but we're a bit unsure about whether that's been successful. So the total at the moment is 24. Okay, so I'm just going to summarise now some key similarities and differences between the 3 groups: the honeybees, the solitaries and the bumbles. So bees are all evolved from wasps around the time when flowering plants started to evolve, and pollen became the sort of way for flowering plants to reproduce. And some wasps started to evolve to, instead of feed their young protein derived from captured prey, they actually started to collect pollen, because pollen is very, very rich and nutritious, and feed it to their grubs. And those wasps, as they evolved, they became bees. So if you like, bees are vegetarian wasps. They're highly specialised, and they are completely vegetarian, which is part of what makes them such effective pollinators. So honeybees, as I've said, 1 species in the UK. They are, again, if we think from an evolutionary perspective, we can think of them as highly evolved in terms of their social behaviour. I have to say, I don't know much about honeybees at all. This is probably the sort of total of my knowledge. So I'm sure if there's any of you that are beekeepers, you'll know far more. But they live in a colony with a queen and her female daughter workers. And the males are produced at certain times, the drones. They're largely domesticated in the UK. They have a barbed sting, so I often get asked if bees sting when they die, and it's only the honeybees where that is the case, because the barb sticks into your skin, and as she pulls away, it damages the bee, and she often dies. Honeybees are also, they have evolved very specially adapted hind legs. If you can actually see in that little picture, we'll have lots more images of these, but they have a widened thigh, if you like, on the back legs, on the hind legs, which is where the pollen is mixed with nectar and sort of stuck on, and we call those pollen baskets the corbicula. And the really sort of important, I suppose, ecological and financial aspect of honeybees is that the colony makes honey, which enables them to survive a temperate winter. And of course, we have harvested that product for many centuries. So bumblebees, I think of it, rightly or wrongly, as almost a chain of evolution. So they're the same as honeybees. They're vegetarian, obviously. 24 species in the UK. There's about 250 species of bumbles in the world. Like the honeybees, they are social insects living in a colony with a queen and her female daughters obviously, her daughter workers, and the males are produced at one point in the colony's life cycle. In the UK, The bumblebees that we have are native, and they're mostly wild, though not exclusively, because we do import factory bred nests to pollinate some of our greenhouse crops. So there's a great big factory, it's in the Netherlands, I think, which produces Bombus terrestris bufftail colonies, which are exported all over the world for pollination. They have a smooth sting, so as I know from bitter experience, they will live to sting again. So they can sting as many times as they want to, but they're not aggressive bees, and they will try not to sting because it takes a lot of energy. Like the honeybees, they are what we call corbiculate bees, having pollen baskets on their hind legs. And very different to honeybees, the queens hibernate alone because true honey isn't made by bumblebees, so they don't have the capacity to survive a temperate winter. Although more and more we are seeing colonies survive through the winter and just carry on feeding and reproducing and completing their life cycles, especially in the southeast of England where it is warmer. Okay, so solitary bees, very generally speaking here, because they are a very diverse group, they are vegetarian, like all of the other bees, around 245 species in the UK, as I've said. In contrast to the other two groups, as the name suggests, for most solitary bees, not all, but for most, the females work alone to build their nests, lay their eggs. They seal up the nest, and there is no parental care other than provisioning each egg with food in the form of pollen, and they overwinter in that form. So they are almost all wild in the UK, although you can buy red mason bees for orchard pollination, but it's not common here particularly. They have a smooth sting. Many of them don't have a big enough sting to have any impact on us at all. They don't have pollen baskets in the form of adapted hind legs, but they do have special pollen carrying hairs on their bodies, but they carry the pollen dry. And in almost all cases, the young overwinter as pupae, as cocoons within the nest, and they emerge as adults in the spring. So again, they have an overwintering phase. Okay, so from now on, we're pretty much going to focus on bumbles, and I'll fill these pictures in because one of their obvious important sort of things that they do is that they pollinate plants, and plants and bees have evolved together. Not just bees are pollinators, as you know, but bumblebees are incredibly effective pollinators, and they are, in some cases, the only pollinator of certain food crops, because they carry out something called buzz pollination, and some plants have become adapted to that. So tomatoes is one example, where the bumblebees have to actually shake the flower by vibrating their flight muscles to knock the pollen off the stamens. And solitary bees and honeybees aren't able to do that effectively. So, as I said, in terms of their economic value, governments have woken up to the plight of bees because they are worth billions of pounds to the global economy. And obviously they also have a massively important intrinsic value, and they pollinate our wild plants as well. So yeah, pretty important little critters they are. And again, you know, in news, the declines have been well documented, And really, the biggest factor in pollinator decline in our ecosystems and our landscapes here in the UK is habitat loss. We hear so much about other issues, you know, such as chemicals, neonicotinoids, etc. But habitat loss since the end of the Second World War and changes in farming methods is the single biggest impact on bumblebees. And I don't know if that will continue because climate change is going to play an increasing part, but the uniformity of our landscape, I mean, that isn't a picture of a Welsh landscape, and I should probably change that actually to perhaps a silage field, because I live in Pembrokeshire and I am surrounded by bright green silage, which of course is just no good for bumblebees at all. There's nothing for them to eat and there's nowhere for them to nest. So those changes have led to major declines. And the first real sort of proper study to document this was in 1980. And people have been recording bumblebees, like we're hopefully going to be doing, since around 1900. But that atlas showed starkly, really, that over a third of our social bumblebees, which I'll come to why I'm saying social, have declined by more than 70% up to 1980. And for a lot of species, that decline has continued, although it is slowing. So a lot of the conservation efforts and realisation of loss of habitat is beginning to have an impact. But a lot of our species are still in real trouble, and their distributions, if you look on maps, you know, the area where any particular species is has declined dramatically for a lot of bumblebees. So we lost 2 species in the latter half of the 20th century. And in Wales, the picture is pretty much the same, even though we have relatively or proportionally more species-rich grassland, sort of per area than England. We've seen the same declines. We have 5 bumblebees on our Section 7 list, which is our species of conservation concern. And those are the shrill cardabee, which is really on the verge of extinction now and only occurs in 5 small populations in the whole of the UK, 3 of which are in Wales. The brown-banded cardabee, the moss cardabee, the red-shanked cardabee, and the ruderal bumblebee, which I don't think has been actually recorded in Wales for a few decades. So we urgently need data on all of our Welsh bumblebee species, and there are patches of Wales which have particular gaps. And I know the Bumblebee Conservation Trust has done a lot of work in South Wales and not enough everywhere else. So I'm really excited that I'm going to be hoping to fill some of these gaps. And the trust was developed by Professor Dave Goulson, who you may have heard of. He wrote A Sting in the Tail. He is an entomologist and an academic, and back about 10 years ago, he felt that his academic work wasn't doing enough, and he founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And we are still very much a science-led organisation, and I'm in the science team, and all the work that I do in the next 3 years with volunteers will feed in to the science and research that the trust contributes to and actively is involved with. But we do loads of other things as well: community engagement and schools work and land advice for landowners. So we have a broad remit, but science underpins everything. So, okay, we'll sort of drill down a little bit now into bumblebees themselves and their little bodies. So over the years, I've had quite a lot of words thrown at me. I've done a lot of works with schools, and people tend to love bumblebees. They're a brilliant group to get people engaged. And I think all the words there on the left are true. They're furry, generally quite fat for a bee and round. They're like little teddy bears, and they're obviously really important pollinators. And the scientific versions of those, they're invertebrates, obviously. They don't have an internal bony skeleton. They're arthropods. This is drilling down through their classification. They are typical insects in that they have a body with 3 segments, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And they have a very typical insect life cycle with an egg, which hatches out into a maggoty-like grub, which feeds and then spins a cocoon in which it molts and eventually emerges as an adult bumblebee. They're hymenopterans, which means they have, that literally means membrane winged. And the hymenopterans include the sawflies, bees, wasps and ants. And they all have 2 pairs of wings, which form, they hook together in flight like Velcro, forming a single membrane, hence hymenopteran. And within that, the bees, wasps and ants form the aculeata, which are the stinging hymenopterans. Only the females sting, okay? They're the feisty ones, and the sting is evolved from an ovipositor, from the egg-laying tube. So the males have never had stings, and they don't have the equipment, okay? And we will use some Latin names. I will use both the English and the Latin. So try not to shy away from the Latin, because it is actually really useful when you're recording. And the generic name for all bumblebees is Bombus. Okay, so just to explain that little comment earlier about our social bumblebees being quantified as being in decline. Just to complicate things, I told you earlier that bumblebees are social creatures, but there are 6 species that flaunt the rules somewhat, and they are the cuckoo bumblebees. So we have 18 what we call truly social bumblebees, and then 6 species have evolved to they basically behave like cuckoo birds. So they will go into the nest, the females of the cuckoos will go into the nest of a truly social bumblebee. They'll wait till she's established the nest and she's got a whole sort of set of workers as offspring. And the female cuckoo will attack and either kill or usurp the social queen. And the cuckoo will take over the nest and lay her own eggs of her own species, but she'll use the workers of the original queen to do all the work. Okay, now cuckoos, I love cuckoo bumblebees. They are absolutely stunning insects because the females tend to be huge. We don't call them queens because there's no caste with cuckoos between queens and workers. They are stunning species to look at. They're very good at confusing us as recorders, and they only ever exist in lower numbers than their host. So they're, you know, it's a perfect balance of nature, as these things always are. And they are actually very good pollinators as well. They don't collect pollen because they get the workers of the other bee to do that, but they do carry it from flower to flower inadvertently. We'll come back to the cuckoos. We're going to do a little bit on the cuckoos, a bit more next week. So when we are recording and identifying bumblebees, we use a little bit of technical language, not very much at all. And I'm sure a lot of you that already are recorders and you record insects, you will know all of this. But as I said earlier, they're split into 3 segments, the body, or 3 sections, I should say, with the head at the top there, and then the thorax is the middle section, and the abdomen is the hind section. The wings and the legs come off the thorax. And with the abdomen, within the trust and within all our ID resources, we refer to the end of the abdomen as the tail. So tail colour is really important in identification. There is no tail, but we just call it the end bit, the tail. And underneath all that fuzziness, bumblebees are all black. So we cannot tell this species. We could possibly, probably not without DNA actually, but they're all black, and we call this the integument. And as bumblebees wear through the season, you can see more and more black coming through in some individuals. But you can clearly see there the abdomen and the thorax, and there is a wasp waist. You know, we talk about wasp's waist. It's not as thin as in a wasp, but it is there. There is a clear waist where the abdomen meets the thorax. Okay, so what I'm going to illustrate now is the bumblebee annual life cycle, because it's really helpful in understanding the behaviour that you're seeing at any particular time of year, and also it helps us in identification. So at this time of year now, I'm sure for the last few weeks, a lot of you have seen the big queen bumblebees emerging from hibernation, and they're, you know, some of them, the buff-tailed bumblebees, are huge. You can't miss them. They're very loud, and they will be initially, there's willow illustrated here. They'll be looking for early pollen and nectar because they're hungry, like any other animal coming out of hibernation. So she will be feeding up the queen as soon as she can, and she'll have been mated the season before, and she will be carrying the sperm in a special sac in her body, so she can fertilise her eggs whenever she wants to, and the males are over and done with. Okay, completely redundant now, and she is self-sufficient. And what you will see after she emerges and she's fed up, she will start to zigzag over the ground looking for nesting sites. So if you see a queen flying very low over the ground, that is what she's doing, and males and workers don't do that at all. And I love this bit of the story because she will collect pollen and nectar initially when she's got her nest up and running, and she will make it into a ball, and she will fertilise and lay her first batch of eggs into that ball of food. But she will also make herself a little wax cup, which is illustrated here, from wax secreted from her body, and she will fill it with nectar, and she will have it just within reach so that she can brood her eggs and drink nectar to sustain herself. And I love that because I think this is an insect, and that behaviour is incredible, you know, that level of behaviour, and also parental care for her offspring. So she broods them like a bird, really. And she may go out during this time. I was always told that they stayed in the nest quite early on, but it isn't actually until the workers hatch that she will remain in the nest. And up till that point, she does need to go out and collect nectar for herself, and also she will eat some pollen as well. And then her first batch of eggs will hatch into female daughter workers, and they will then really take over the running of the nest. The workers really are, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but they really are busy bees. They are amazing, and they're incredibly industrious. They protect the nest, they clean the nest, they build cells in which is stored pollen and nectar, and in which the eggs are laid, and the queen then really becomes an egg laying machine. So that's why we see so many smaller bumblebees through the summer. And then towards the end of the colony life cycle, she will lay eggs slightly differently, and they will turn into males and new queens, new daughter queens. And they will leave the nest. They won't really take part in looking after the nest. They leave the nest and go off and look for males and queens from a different nest and hopefully find each other. And that's when mating takes place, towards the end of the colony life cycle. And once a new queen is mated, she will feed up and look for somewhere to hibernate and to start the cycle again. So it's an annual cycle. Some species will have 2 of these cycles within 1 year, but most of our native bumblebees just do that once. And the timings vary slightly depending on species. Okay, so how can that help us? Well, a few ways. So when we are recording, it's really, really good if we can begin to record the cast as well as the species. So queens are really lovely to learn on because they're quite big, so you can see their colours quite clearly. When they emerge in the spring, there are no workers and males around to confuse you. So it's quite nice to get out there earlier and sort of get your eye in with queens. They're often very fresh and bright because they haven't had a chance to fade, because bumblebees get bleached and lose their colours. They have that characteristic nest finding behaviour. So if you see that, you know you've got a queen. They collect pollen, so you will sometimes see them, and you can see her lovely corbicula, her shiny back legs there. That's her pollen basket. And they buzz very loudly, so you can often hear them before you can see them, which is really nice. And then you can follow them, which is what I do often. The workers are going to come out later. So some species, the workers are emerging now. People are submitting records of workers. They're very, very active. So when you see them, they will be moving quite fast. They will be nectaring, or they will be collecting pollen. You might even see them buzz pollinating on things like comfrey. And they're quite numerous. And in most species, they're smaller versions of the queens in terms of colour, but not all. Okay. And the males, the pesky males, they can be completely different within a species. Some species have what we call sexual dimorphism, where the males have a different colour pattern to the females. So you'd have to learn both, but we're not going to do that till next week. They appear later in the year. So late in the year, you might get males, workers and new queens emerging. So it gets a little bit harder later in the summer. They're never ever seen with pollen because they don't have the equipment to collect it, but they do carry, they will get it on their hair inadvertently. Behaviour wise, they often sit on flowers supping nectar quite lazily. They're often much fluffier than the females, and they often have facial hair, which is the similarities to Homo sapiens is quite amazing. Some of them have yellow facial hair, and we will go over this again. I'm just kind of whizzing through really to set the scene. And the males have longer antennae, which we will look at in more detail. Okay, so that's a sort of introduction to the 3 casts and how the time of year can influence what you see. Right, we're going to start on identification now, and today all we're going to do is look at identifying the queens. Looking at that poll, we have got quite a knowledgeable group, so I do apologise again if this is a bit basic, but next week we will build on it. So I think when you're starting out, there are a series of questions to ask yourself once you have an insect that you're looking at. The first one is perhaps, is it a bee? Because it might not be, especially for those of you who are beginners. There's a lot of bumblebee mimics out there. If you're pretty confident that it is bee, is it a bumblebee as opposed to a honey or a solitary bee? We want to be able to sex the bee wherever we can and record that. We want to be aware of the cuckoo bumblebee, social bumblebee hosts, because they kind of come in pairs. And when we have perhaps worked out all of those questions, then we want to be trying to identify species, and we will cover recording a bit more next week. But when we submit a record, we do want to be as sure as we can be that our identification is correct. So identification absolutely comes before recording. Okay, so I took these two images last year, just as we came out of the first lockdown, about this time of year actually, up in the Preselies in Pembrokeshire. And would you like to pop in the chat which one you think is the bee? Or just do it in your head. You don't have to put it in the chat if you don't want to. But which one is the bee? The bumblebee out of those two. So we've got 5. Okay, looks good, looks good. Yeah, well done. Well done. Oh, you are quite a good group. I'm not just saying that. I've had varying responses to this. B is the bumblebee, correct? Oh, that's it. B is the bumblebee, and A is a hoverfly. But it is a fantastic, super duper bumblebee mimic. They're actually nectaring on the same plant, so you can see why you could be confused in the field. You know, especially if you're just looking quickly or they're moving quickly. So I think that's Vollicella bombilans, which is a particularly fine bumblebee mimic, beautiful fly. And there again, this time the bumblebee is on the left and the hoverfly is on the right. And the key difference really in the field is in their heads. So if we look to the head of each insect, the bumblebee has much more obvious, more substantial antennae. The hoverfly's antennae are very small and inconspicuous. But conversely, the compound eyes of the hoverfly cover almost the whole head. They're huge. And on the bumblebee, they're very much lateral. They're very much on the side of the head. So the head is the place to look for bees and flies. And you can see that there in profile. You've got the longer antennae and the sides very much, the eyes lateral on the bumblebee. And in diagrammatic form, that is how their heads might look from above. So they're quite distinctive. Flies only have 1 pair of wings as well, and bees have 2, but that's often quite difficult to observe in the field. Okay, so once you kind of separated your bees from their mimics, obviously there are nearly 280 species of bee in the UK. So separating your bumbles, A is the bumblebee, which I'm sure you know, from your solitary bees is critical. Most solitary bees don't look like bumblebees at all, apart from a few. And I'm just calling out this one, the hairy-footed flower bee, which is the most bumblebee-like. But there aren't any bumblebees which are all black with the yellow black legs like that, or yellowy orange black back legs. But yeah, you know, it is confusing for people when they start out, for sure. So males or females, I'm just going to really repeat what I said earlier, but with just a little bit more detail and some better images. So male bumblebees are fluffier and scruffier. This is a male Bombus genalis, the heath bumblebee. This is a male brown-banded carder, and you can see they're quite fluffy, quite shaggy. 4 out of our 8 common ones have yellow facial hair. The males have spindly legs, hind legs, compared to the females. You can't see here, but I've got another image later on. And the males have these lovely long, often droopy antennae compared to the females. They never carry pollen, and they have somewhat slower, lazier, if you like, behaviour, because they're not actually working as the females do. They're just drinking nectar really and waiting for queens to arrive. And conversely, the females, you can see this female bufftail, queen bufftail, she's very neat and very velvety. They're not all like that, but the females are generally neater. You can see her beautiful pollen baskets on her back leg there. The females never have the same extent of yellow on the face. The bilberry bumblebee can have a little bit of yellow on her face, actually, just a tiny bit, but never in the extent of the males. And they may be carrying pollen, like this queen here. Huge amounts of pollen on her. The females have shorter, more upright antennae, which most people find really easy to notice in the field. I never did when I was learning, but a lot of people do key into that, and they tend to be much busier. Okay. So a little introduction to the cuckoos here, which we'll come back to next week, just to make you aware. So if you remember, the cuckoos are effectively parasitic on the truly social bumblebees, and there are 6 of these, all of which we have in Wales. The females, apart from one species, are really big and quite fierce looking, and they often appear quite dark. There's often a lot of black and no central yellow banding, although they have different colour patterns, but generally don't have a middle yellow band. They often have slightly smoky wings, and in one particular species, the wings are very blackened, so they have darker wings. Even the females have no pollen baskets, so their legs are, in comparison, are more spindly and hairy. Their movement appears lumbering, and the more cuckoos you see, the more experience you have. For me personally, the more tuned into that behaviour I've become. So when I see a cuckoo or a bee moving on a flower, I can sort of think, oh, that looks like it could be a cuckoo, before I've sort of looked very much at the colours. They are relatively short-tongued, and at this time of year, they can often be spotted on things like dandelions, because they appreciate the openness of the flower and the ease of getting the nectar from that open flower. So they're not as long-tongued as the truly social ones. Okay, we will come back to them. So once you've got your insect and you're pretty sure it's a bumblebee, and you're pretty sure it's the social bumblebee, because we'll ignore the cuckoos for now, we need to ask some more questions to start to narrow it down to species. And we will look at how we pot bees when we do a field day, and I have got more details on how you do that next week as well, because it really helps if you can pot them. So looking at species, and cast, we'll look at tail colour, and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust leads on tail colour to narrow down your choices. So I will follow that pattern pretty much today. And then banding. So looking at the coloured bands on the bee, in this case there are none. Facial hair, as we've already said, legs, and antennae can help sex the bee and work out which caste it is. And we can also consider clues from behaviour and seasonality. So, you know, it's often a suite of clues that help us to arrive at a species when we're starting out and learning. People often ask about size, and what I've realised with this slide, because I've done this talk a few times now, is that I tell you that size is not very useful, and then I'm constantly referring to it. But the reason we have to be wary of it is that they do vary both between species, but also within a species and even within a colony. So we can say that, generally speaking, certain queens of certain species, like bufftails, are big. And queens of other species, such as the early bumblebee, are relatively small. And same for the workers. But within a colony, you might get tiny workers, and you might get bigger workers, and you might get some workers that are almost as big as the queens. So there is a lot of variety, and it depends a lot on how much those workers were fed as grubs. Males tend to be a little bit more consistent within a species and tend to be about 2/3 the size of a queen. Okay, so it's just experience with the size, but we don't tend to rely on it. So if we think about that sort of little fan of clues that I put up, tail colour, we look at extent and also depth of colour. So all of these species, the early bumblebee, the red-tailed bumblebee and the bilberry bumblebee, we describe as having red tails. But you can see in the early bumblebee, it's barely noticeable. In the red tail, it's about probably 1/3 of the extent of the abdomen. But in the bilberry bumblebee, it goes up way beyond half of the abdomen. So we look at not only the colour, but the extent as well. With the banding, we look very much at position of bands and number of bands as well. So in this species, in the whitetail, we would describe this as having a yellow collar, so a band on the thorax, at the front of the thorax, and we describe it as having a yellow band in the centre of the abdomen there. Okay, so abdominal band. In the garden bumblebee, in this one, there are actually 3 bands, and their position, the collar is the same as the whitetail, but it has a second band on the thorax, and the abdominal band is right there at the waist, meeting that thoracic band. So it almost looks like a yellow belt. And that's how we describe. So there's 2 on the thorax and 1 on the abdomen, but the positioning is different. And in this cuckoo bumblebee, again, there are 2 yellow bands with a collar, and the second band is actually just above the tail. Okay, I will revisit all of the species, but just to give you the kind of language that we use, really. And faces, just going into detail, bumblebees have the greatest faces. They never cease to amaze me, really. So it is actually quite easy if they're foraging, or if you've managed to pot bee, you can see very clearly the hair on this one has got a yellow moustache. That's a little male. So they can be useful in separating males and females. And for of our common species have yellow faces, and in some species the shape is useful. So this is a garden bumblebee which has a particularly long face. And this is a red-tailed bumble, which I just think is a lovely image, and you can see all the pollen on her head there, where she's been foraging. And as we've said, if it's carrying pollen, you know it's a female straight away. Okay, because males are never going to do that. But if it isn't carrying pollen, then you can't be sure, because obviously not all females are going to have pollen at any one time. Oops. And just a little bit more detail on the legs. This is really kind of the next level of learning. But when we pot bumblebees and we're trying to get an identification with the sex, with the caste, we look very closely with a hand lens at the legs. So basically, the male social bumblebee, the cuckoo, male and female, are all fairly spindly and hairy. And the female, and you can see the hairs here on the upper part of the hind leg, and the female here, the female social bumblebee, is distinctly different, but you really need a hand lens at times to see that. Not always, but some of the time. And again, just some close-ups on what I said about the antennae. This female here, you can see her lovely short, very upright elbowed antennae, whereas the male, there's still a little bit of an elbow there, but it's much droopier from that point. And it's because the males have 13 segments in their antennae, which you can see there, and the females have 12, so they appear shorter. Okay, and like I've already said, the female social bumblebees are almost always working. They can be quiet if the weather's cold, etc. The queens will fly low when looking for nests. This is an early bumblebee queen, which I photographed rummaging around in some leaf litter on a hedge bank in my garden. So that gives you an indication of a nice nesting spot there. She didn't stay, but that's where she was looking. And males and cuckoos will often hang around feeding very lazily on flowers in sort of these gangs. You'll hardly ever see females in a group like that, but the males are sort of often in a particular location waiting for queens, so they're all together, yeah, crawling over the flowers, then nectaring to keep their energy levels up. These are actually male cuckoo bumblebees on a perennial cornflower in my garden. Really, really good bumblebee species for midsummer. Okay, right. So here we have the big 8. And the Bumblebee Conservation Trust groups them according to tail colour. I've messed up their grouping slightly, and I'll explain why now. So on the left here in these 2 columns, I've put the white tail bumblebees with yellow stripes, basically. When I showed this to my husband, who knows nothing about bumblebees, the first thing he said, well, that's not a white tail. And he's right. The buff tail queens, it's never white in a buff tail queen. It's always a buff colour, and it can actually be quite dark, but that's how we describe it. So white tail with yellow stripes are here, and the first column, the first pair, are those pesky 2, the buff tails and the white tails. And today we're just going to look at the queens. So we describe those as having the same colour pattern, but in the buff tail, that tail is darker, and so it distinguishes them, because it always is. They're quite easy, the queens are easy to tell apart. The second pair is white tail with 3 yellow stripes, and that's both the garden bumblebee and the heath bumblebee, Bombus genellus, one of my favourite species. And we'll go into telling those apart. Well, I'll just say the main thing is that the garden bumblebee has a long face, okay, and it is much more widespread than the heath bumblebee as well, so it's the one you're more likely to see. And then the two with we describe as having red tails are the early bumblebee and the red-tailed bumblebee. The early bumblebee queen, the red, as we saw in the image earlier, is not that extensive, and she has two bright yellow stripes. The red-tailed bumblebee queen is very distinctive. I'm sure most of you know her, with her lovely red tail and her all black body. And then the last pair, this is where I've just strayed from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust kind of classification a little bit, because they put the tree bumblebee in with the white tails, but I've put it in with the as a gingery one, in a gingery pair with the common carder, because in the field these two can all often look really similar and people can get them mixed up. But the tree bumblebee, gingery russety thorax, lovely very wide black section on the abdomen, and always a snowy white tail. And the common carder is not a brilliant representation here, but it's our only common all ginger bee. But we'll have a look at some photographs now to see that a bit more clearly. So our common 8 queens in photographic form. We've got the buff tail there with her buff coloured tail and her darker, oh, I've lost the cursor, there it is, darker yellow stripes. They can be quite deep, as opposed to the white tail, which is more often a lovely bright lemon yellow with a pure white tail. So those queens are distinct from each other. The 2 red-tailed species, we've got the red tail there with a beautiful black body, and the early bumblebee with just a hint of red at her bottom and 2 beautiful yellow bright stripes. And then that, don't forget, that is the queen. Okay. And then the garden bumblebee, annoyingly I should have had the white tail on there, but it is white-tailed always. And then 3 yellow stripes, if you remember, one at the collar, one at the back of the thorax, which meets the one at the top of the abdomen. So it looks like a yellow belt in that particular image, but it is actually 3 stripes. And you can see in the buff and the white tail, that abdominal stripe is lower down the abdomen. And then the heath bumblebee here, 3 yellow stripes. It's smaller and fluffier than the garden bumblebee. And do you remember about the face? So the long face there on the garden bumblebee and the small round face on the heath. And I would hope in your, what we'll do next week, Ben, is actually we'll do a live search on Aderyn with everyone watching. We'll get the website up and we'll look for records of the heath bumblebee, because I'd love to see what you've got in your area in the uplands of Powys of this species. And then the gingery ones, we've got the common carder there with a lovely sort of gingery bright thorax. The abdomen can vary and it often appears quite black and ginger, but it never has a white tail ever. Even though it's quite pale underneath there, it doesn't have the white tail of the tree bumblebee, which is really distinctive. Okay, so tree bumblebee, lovely tawny thorax, black, white. Okie dokes. Okay. I'm hoping you're going to do this with ease. Feel free to put your answers in the chat. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you an image of a queen. You look at the tail colour first, if that helps you, to narrow it down to either the white-tailed species over here on the right, or the ginger ones up on the top left, or the red-tailed 2 species at the bottom left. and then use the bands to work out your species or any other clues that you may have or you may spot. So yeah, so it's a process of elimination, really. Do you want to have a go at identifying that queen? Just do it in your head or pop it in the chat. I'll give you 30 seconds or so. Which species? Use your sheet if you've got it to hand to help you as well. Oh, chat's speeding up here. Yeah, well done everyone. All looks good. Early. Everyone's saying early. Yes. Yeah. Okay, just close that. Yeah. So I don't want to rush people if they're working it out, but yeah, so look at her bottom, little peachy bottom there. So red tail. So go to the two that have got the red tails, and obviously she's got her 2 yellow stripes. So that's a Queen Bombus pretorum, the early bumblebee. Lovely, love that species. Oh, come on, computer. Okay, that's hopefully quite an easy one. Let's pop it in the chat or just answer in your own head. Which one? What do you think that one is? Yeah, good. Well done. Yeah, that's quite an easy one. So that's common carder. Gingery, so straight to the top left. It's got to be one of these two. You could sort of, is that tail whitish? Not really, it's cream. Tree bumblebee would be pure white, and you'd have black on the abdomen. So yeah, that's common carder, Bombus proscorum. Oh, right, that's a giveaway. So I'm expecting the chat to be full of answers for that one. There's no tricks, there's no rare species or cuckoos in this. So that's easy, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, red tail queen. Okay, good. What about that one? So you can just about see her tail there. Yeah, chat's going up. Yeah, no, you are quite a knowledgeable group. I'm definitely female, yes, with huge pollen baskets. Yeah, everybody's got that in the chat. Yeah, so that's a white-tailed queen. Can't really be anything else. She's got a white tail and 1, 2 yellow stripes, and her tail is pure white, so it can't be a buff tail. Okay, hopefully you can see this video. Ben, is that video okay? Just play it again.
Yep, that's playing.
So what about that one? What species is that one? Okay, good. Yeah, it is another white tail. And feeding on heathers there, in my experience, you do get quite a lot of white tails in the uplands. I don't get them much where I am in Pembrokeshire at all, in fact. I get loads of buff tails, but not white tails. So, and I often see them up on the Preselles in the same sort of habitat as the Heath bumblebee. Oh, okay, this isn't a very good photograph at all, and it sort of illustrates how not to take a photograph for identification. But what do you think that one is?
Claire, it might be how not to take a photo, but a lot of them come out looking like this.
Yeah, I'm going to just talk about photographs a bit at the end. So you can't see its tail. So do you think you can do it from that? Because you very often can't from photographs. But let's have a look. Yeah, really hard with that tail. Yeah, Tammy, that I think that's really good before early. That's a good sort of hedging your bets on two that it could be. Yeah, Mary, head shape not that useful on this one actually. I don't think so. Okay. So without the tail, when you're beginning, especially, and even when you're more experienced, it can be impossible to tell. From looking at that, I'm almost certain it's a buff tail, just because those bands are really dark orangey colour. Tammy's suggestion, it could be an early, because the early would have two bands in those exact positions. But I don't think it is, just because of its, dare I say, its size and shape. It looks like a big hefty buff tail, and like I said, the early, the yellow is brighter. But there might be some experts who say, well, you know, I wouldn't accept that record. There's just not enough detail. But I would say, in my experience, that's almost certainly a buff tail. Okay, but tricky to tell. And what about this one? Feeding on the old chives there. Nice favourite. Oh gosh, the chat's, yeah, well done everyone. Tree bumblebee, bombus hypnorum. Really, really typical. Nice specimen. Really lovely. Okay. And just very quickly before we finish, photographing bumbles, as we've seen, if you're doing it for identification, a side view like this is great, because you get to see the bands if there are bands, and you get to see the tail, and very often, like on that one, you can see the pollen baskets as well. So a profile shot is great. This not such a great shot of mine. That could be a buff or a early, couldn't it? Because that yellow is bright, but it's not that bright. I can't remember what it was actually when I took it. This is an image of a brown banded carder, one of the rarer ones. It's not a brilliant identification image, but you can see that lovely brown band there on the brown banded carder and the beautiful pale colouring. So I think you would be confident of an ID from that one. And again, headshots can be useful, but really not without the rest of the body. So a headshot is a good addition to a set of photographs if you can get it. And this is a cuckoo bee that was, I was very confident it was a male with those lovely long antennae, so I wasn't going to get stung. And he was very slow and sleepy, so I put him on my hand and was able to take a few shots of him to take home and study. And that's Bombus barbitellus, one of the cuckoo bees. So the more shots you can get, the better for identification purposes. And when you submit them into Lurk Wales or I Record as well with good photographs, it means the experts that are verifying them are much more confident of accepting that record. So before we finish, what it would be really great if you could do before next week, because next week we're going to go into those 8 species in more detail, and we're going to do the workers and the males, and we're going to look a little bit more at the cuckoos as well, and at recording. But it would be great if before we do, if you have time and the energy, could you take a photograph of a bumblebee and send it to me? I'll give you my email address in a second. The other thing I was going to say about photographs as well is that I actually I do have quite a good point and shoot macro camera, but I also got a secondhand dare I say it, Huawei phone, Huawei Pro 20, which has a Leica lens, a double Leica lens, and it is brilliant at macro. And it just means that wherever I am, if I see a bumblebee, you know, I'm not always going to carry my camera, but I've always got my phone. And I just find it so useful. And some of the photographs you've seen today are just taken with my phone. So having a reasonably good phone on your camera can actually be a really useful recording tool. But if you can go out this week and take just one bumblebee, you can send me more than one picture, but try and make it of the same bee. And it doesn't have to be one of the big 8. If you're more advanced, you can go for, if you see something else, you know, give it a go, send it to me and tell me what you think it is. And if you're a complete beginner, then, you know, just have a go at deciding whether it's a honeybee or a bumblebee, or whatever level you're at, just send me a picture. And if you could put on it BIS, so that I know it's from the BIS course from today, because I'm doing lots and lots of courses every week at the moment, then I'll just know that it's from this group. And next week, I will put the pictures up with your IDs. I will do it anonymously, and we can have a go as a group, and see how you got on. Okay, so that would be good. So far with the groups I've done it, they've sent some real corkers, like they've thrown up some cuckoos and some melanic oddities of common species and all sorts of brilliant stuff. So yeah, it'd be really great to see what you've got. And there's my email address. You can also Ben can send you that if necessary. And I'm going to stop sharing now and see if there are any questions.